I remember the day she said it like a verdict, a clipped sentence delivered over the clatter of dishes and the soft hiss of the radiator. "Oh, you'll never be famous." It wasn't the first time my mother had tried to trim my ambitions to fit the modest blueprint of our lives. The safe job, the small apartment, the quiet calendar of bills and birthdays. But something in the way she said that sentence, final and small and indifferent, lodged in me like a splinter under a fingernail. I was 21, my hair a riot of untrimmed curls and my pockets empty, and I had a guitar shoved into the back of my hand-me-down Honda like a fragile weapon. I left the house that afternoon with the sentence echoing in my head, and a kind of determination I'd never named before, not to punish her with cruelty, not to hurt her with spite, but to live a life so luminous and undeniable that the sound of my own voice would become the thing that changed her. The instrument by which the scales tipped. The revenge I imagined was not a blade but a microphone, not a scandal but a song that would replay itself in the small room where she sat and made tea, would float through the cheap speakers of the radio she trusted and catch her by the throat with something like awe. It would be the kind of success that humiliated her doubt by making it irrelevant. Not because I wanted to prove her wrong, but because I wanted the world to witness the truth of a voice she had dismissed. In the years that followed, revenge would morph into something more complicated, a study of pride and apology of the slow alchemy that transforms rage into art. The early years were brutal and beautiful. Slept on couches, learned to eat ramen with the kind of philosophical calm that could only come from starvation, and filled tiny apartments with borrowed amps and sticky notes with lyric snippets. I wrote incessantly in waiting rooms on napkins during lousy dates, in the middle of night shifts at a coffee shop that smelled of burnt espresso and sweet loneliness. My songs were raw and a little wrong like me. They stitched together the bruises of adolescence and the small triumphs that seemed like miracles. I learned how to carry a melody like a secret, soft in my chest, then louder, getting braver as a chorus approached. I played bar gigs where the audience consisted of bartenders and one or two loyal friends, the sweat of the night making the lights blur into halos. A woman named June slapped my shoulder once and said, "You're not selling anything to anyone. You're giving them a place to land." That line became a private weather vane. I wanted to give people a place to land, and I wanted my mother to have to land there too. But I told myself that was selfishness masked as righteousness. I had a couple of small breaks. A college radio station played a demo. A local blogger wrote a piece calling me urgent, which sounded like a word meant for someone else, something bigger. Then miraculously, almost accidentally, an indie producer in the city slid into my DM after a gig and offered to do a proper record. The studio smelled of citrus cleaner and old coffee, and the engineer was patient in the way people who love sound can be patient. He would play the same take 10 times while I tried to find my throat and failed, then find it again in a moment of tired surrender. We recorded a song called A Glass in My Hands, about holding something fragile and deciding to believe in it anyway. The mix was thin, but it had a pulse, and when I uploaded it to a small streaming platform and labeled it with my real first name as if daring fate to notice, something in the internet shifted. It was not immediate celebrity. Instead, it was a small, relentless ripple. A playlist curatorial intern added the song to an influential list. People I had never met messaged me with sentences that felt like currency. "This made me cry on the subway. I played this to my sister all night." My inbox gathered names and small confessions, and once a message from my father. A man who had been absent like a backbeat. That read, simply, "I heard you." He didn't call. He didn't show up, but he finally used the verb for me, and that mattered. Then Spotify, which felt to me like a country with cities and neighborhoods all its own, picked up the track for an editorial playlist. My listener count climbed in a way that was slow but inexorable, like a river cutting through stone. I learned the strange arithmetic of streaming platforms. 1,000 plays felt huge and yet tiny. 100,000 played like a drum roll. There were nights I fell asleep hearing my own voice loop in my head. A lullaby and a victory speech braided into one. The first time I saw my name on a billboard, A tiny fleeting mention in a collage of faces in a subway station. My lungs filled up with a kind of cocktail of disbelief and vindication. I texted my mother a picture. She stared at her phone for a while and replied, "That's nice." There was no exclamation point. There was no pride that I could taste. And then "that's nice" ignited something in me that I later recognized as the old Splinter. I kept working. Songs came faster, as if my body were catching up to a voice that had been waiting inside me all along. The work itself was a kind of revenge against the quiet that had once told me I was small. I toured through rust-colored towns and cities with names that tasted like vowels and consonants, and I learned how to read rooms, where to bend, where to stand. Wherever I went, I left a little of myself behind, a worn pick, a lyric scrawled on a napkin, a promise to come back. My manager, a blunt, brilliant woman named Ada, pushed me hard in the way mentors do when they love results more than tenderness. She taught me the marketplace of music, how to seed playlists, how to cultivate a brand without becoming a caricature, when to stay raw and when to let the polish show. I learned ad buys and metadata like other people learn recipes and names. We released an album called Open Windows, which critics called a confessing without pretense, and people started to call me in features the voice of a generation. A phrase that felt simultaneously flattering and terrifying. The first time my mother cried when my song played on Spotify, it was at my first sold-out hometown theater show. Ada had convinced me to invite her, using a soft kind of manipulation that coaxed family into being present for spectacle. She sat in the back row, hands folded exactly like an old photograph, as if she had decided to be both observer and judge. The lights dimmed and I walked onto stage and found the air in the theater humid and expectant. I sang like someone lifting a secret from the floorboards, and when the chorus arrived, the room seemed to inhale as one. After the show, a line formed for autographs and selfies. Strangers clung to me as if I had been their confidant for years. I saw my mother then waiting by the exit as if she had been practicing a new shape. Her eyes were shining. There were tracks on her cheeks where tears had been. She told me, in halting sentences, that my voice had caught her off guard, that it had made her remember the child who refused the small script she'd handed me. She tried to be proud and failed on the first try. Her pride was awkward, like a borrowed coat. I had imagined that moment 1,000 different ways, triumphant, cold, quietly satisfied, and it turned out to be tender, complicated, and unexpectedly soft. I wanted to tear down everything I'd built around the idea of revenge and sit on the floor and talk with her until dawn. But old instincts are stubborn. I folded something inward, like folding a letter you never send. Success was not a straight line. There were betrayals and bad contracts and nights the city hummed with possibility, and my bank account read like a poem of loss. There were men who wanted to date the idea of me more than me, managers who nodded and fleeced, and friends who drifted away because proximity often comes with envy. As playlists rotated and algorithmic gods decided which songs would keep breathing and which would fade, my career had a rhythm of feast and famine. The revenge, when it arrived, never felt like the dramatic cinematic takedown I'd imagined. It was small. A profile piece where my mother was quoted without consent and appeared beautifully human. A late-night show where an older woman in the audience mouthed my lyrics like she had learned them in a second childhood. A viral clip of a grandmother reaching for me as if to hold on to the part of herself she had thought lost. People began to send me videos. Mothers crying at my songs, teenagers singing into their phones, couples slow dancing in tiny kitchens. The world responded to a voice that had been raised in kitchens and living rooms, and now reached rooms I couldn't have imagined as a child. The revenge had braided itself into something else, relational, tender, a proof that art can shift the geometry, people's affections. But revenge is a shape-shifting thing. Sometimes it finds you in the reflection of a window, or in the way a sentence is read aloud on a podcast where the host intones a lyric, and the line lands like a small miracle. The more I succeeded, the more my mother's defenses softened, and I found her vulnerability both soothing and discomfiting. She began to talk about the practicalities of my fame, who to trust, how to read contracts, with a sharpness that revealed her own latent intelligence. She asked me questions about royalties and publishing as if she had suddenly become my business partner. It felt like being both parent and child, like treading the line of a map that had been redrawn. There were private moments of rupture and repair, a phone call where she admitted she had been afraid for me, frightened that the world would chew me up, a text where she confessed she'd said the harsh sentence out of worry that I would be disappointed. The truth is, people often say cruel things from a place of love disguised as fear. There were also moments when I used my success like currency to cajole the past into apology. I paid for repairs to the house she'd lived in for decades, fixed the leaky roof, repainted the hallway in a color she had once loved but never bought for herself. I bought her a cheap smart speaker and taught her how to make it play my music. She would press the play button with a kind of reverence, and sometimes the device would mishear and play a podcast about gardening instead, and we'd laugh at the ridiculousness of technology, failing to bridge the human to bridge the human. I felt guilty each time I used money as a salve because the wound was not about the roof but about the voice she had never believed in. Yet when she cried listening to my voice on Spotify, not for the checklist I had crossed but because the music moved her, it created a new ledger of meaning. Tears, once a weapon, became proof. The revenge narrative is seductive because it offers a clean arc: doubt, defiance, victory, humiliation of the doubter. Real life predictably is messy. There were nights when I lay awake thinking about the cost. Did turning my doubt into art make me complicit in weaponizing my wounds? Had I used my own grief as a tool to exact satisfaction? There were songs written in the attic of our childhood home, between the boxes of old holiday decorations and a trunk of clothes with moth-eaten collars. I would sit on the floor and let my voice break and then find it again and think about the ethics of revenge. Was art an acceptable outlet for vengeance, or was it something that required an offering of compassion? These questions sat in my playlist next to the hits people shared. At some point, public opinion began to shape my private narrative. I read comments on forums where strangers parsed my relationship with my mother as if it were a plot device. A classic redemption arc, one person wrote. She used her mama's tears for PR, wrote another. The second stung in a way that was almost pleasurable. A complicated prickle of being seen and judged. My mother, for her part, experienced the public gaze with a mix of embarrassment and secret delight. There was a day she told me to be careful about my friends, specifically naming a woman who'd interviewed me for a glossy magazine and called her too polished. She mistrusted people with glossy surfaces, as if shininess invited corruption. Sometimes she would call and say, "You don't have to do this," meaning the career, the interviews, the relentless airing of intimacy. I would tell her I had to. There was an urgency in my need to keep singing, as if stopping would mean shrinking back into a life that had once contained me. When the streaming numbers hit a plateau and a rival pop artist released a song that mirrored a melodic turn from my early demo, enough to make my fans squawk on social events. Media, I felt the old anger rising, the sense that my work could be assimilated and repackaged. But the public defended me, and in their defense I felt an odd kinship that was not about winning against my mother, but about preserving the integrity of the thing I had built out of shard and stitch. There were also moments when I felt my mother's voice resurface not in the stands of public debate, but in private confession. One winter, after a concert where the crowd had held their breath for a 2-hour set, she called me and said, "When I hear you sing, I feel like I get another life." She told me she had been small when she said I'd never be famous, born out of her own fear that the world would be cruel to me in ways she knew too intimately. She spoke in the language of regret and protection, and for the first time I allowed myself to receive her apology without turning it into another performance. There was a small, bright moment of shared humanity then, like sunlight through a cracked window. Still, the itch to prove, to score, to make the sentence "you'll never be famous" feel absurd in the face of proof lingered. It hummed beneath my ribcage like a secret radio. I started an album whose entire architecture was built on the theme of living inside someone else's smallness and building a life that refused it. The album was not purely for revenge. It was an attempt at translation, turning the language of hurt into language that could be shared and thus healed. Critics called it my most personal work. Fans said it felt like someone had finally explained them in song. My mother cried when she heard the first single, a kettle boiling, a lyric that used the metaphor of patience and heat and the eventual softening of something once raw. She called me the day the single hit 1 million streams and said, "I didn't believe you when you were 17. I thought I was protecting you." Her voice was thin with weariness and pride. "I am sorry," she said. And in that sentence she folded many years into one small, incandescent thing. There were quieter forms of revenge, the ones that left no audience but the heart. I conquered spaces she'd told me were unreachable. Stages with velvet curtains, radio interviews with hosts who asked me to tell the truth about my process, late-night television where my voice sounded tinny but real over the studio monitors. I gave commencement speeches to college students about persistence and fear and about the strange currency of disappointment. I taught a songwriting workshop in the same town where she had once insisted I take a real job, and students, young, hungry, improbably sincere, told me their lives had shifted because one of my songs had started their morning on repeat. I watched an entire generation learn to hold its breath and then breathe again to something I had written in a cramped apartment 3 years earlier. There was a deep, private satisfaction in that, the knowledge that the art itself could be a form of justice. But here is the nuance. The soundtrack of my success was not only the sound of my mother's tears, it was also the sound of my own ongoing re-education, of learning what generosity looks like when it's not tied to approval, and of recognizing that love is sometimes the thing that accidentally harms. My mother, who had been stern and practical her whole life, began to show a softer side that felt almost foreign to me. She would leave sticky notes on my doorstep with lines of lyrics she liked, or a jar of jam she'd made and labeled in her uneven handwriting. She learned to navigate the strange world of celebrity with a humility I admired. She accepted compliments awkwardly, deflected praise to me as if she had nothing to do with it, and then sometimes took her moment on stage with a modest pride that made me ache. I watched her interact with my fans, and there was a tenderness there that felt like repair. The revenge arc that began with a sentence in our kitchen eventually gave way to forgiveness, and then to a deeper understanding that neither victory nor apology can be the final note in a human life. There were moments of relapse. The day she said something sharp in front of my friends at a dinner, and I felt that old sting. The time she ignored an invitation to a charity benefit I hosted because she was embarrassed by the attention. There were also moments that defied categorization. A call at 2 in the morning after she'd watched a documentary about a singer and felt raw about the fragility of careers. A voicemail she left me after hearing my voice in a grocery store and being recognized and hugged by strangers. Each event recast. We learned to negotiate new boundaries. I learned to separate my worth from her validation. She learned that her fear did not mean the end of my dreams. The story of our relationship became over time less about proving and more about learning to be present in each other's lives. The public narrative, of course, simplified things. Profiles clipped and smoothed and turned a messy patchwork of family history into a neat arc that sold magazines. People loved a redemption story. A daughter proves herself, a mother weeps with pride. It made for a tidy headline. But the truth resides in the unglamorous texture of daily living, the long conversations that stitch the day together, the unspoken moments of embarrassment, the phone calls where silence is as meaningful as words. My mother and I became slowly collaborators in each other's survival. She would send me playlists of songs that moved her, and I would send her early mixes not to manipulate, but because I wanted her opinion. She learned the technical phrase for a mastering, which pleased her more than I'd expected. She would tell her friends with a kind of conspiratorial glee, things like, "Oh, my daughter mixed that herself." It felt like a small revolution, a reclamation of voice on both sides. In the years that followed, my music career evolved. I experimented with genres, collaborated with artists across continents, and lent my voice to causes I believed in. There were moments where the fame felt dangerous, where the internet's quickness to judge made me small again, but the art itself remained a lodestar. I started a foundation to help young musicians from marginalized backgrounds, get access to instruments and studio time. Because I remembered the way a borrowed amp had felt like a promise. This act of giving back reframed my relationship with success. It was no longer entirely about proving anything to my mother or to the audience that had once passed me by. It was about creating more people who could stand up and be heard. The sweetest revenge, paradoxically, became the making of space. Even as the outer world shifted, as algorithms changed and tastes evolved, and the music industry scrolled like an ever-updating feed, the sound of my mother crying when my voice came on did not become less meaningful. If anything, it acquired layers. Her tears were not only for the fame, but for the unfolding of a life where her child had found a path through a landscape she had been unable to imagine. Sometimes when she heard my voice on Spotify, she would text me a single emoji, a little teardrop. Sometimes she would call and say, in a voice that trembled with being both small and proud, "Every time your song plays, I feel like I'm listening to someone brave." Those words filled me with a tenderness that required no tearing down. I will not pretend that everything was resolved neatly by streaming numbers and interviews. Some wounds are stubborn and resist closure. Old sentences have a way of returning like weather. Yet what replaced the need for revenge was not indifference, but an ongoing practice of noticing. Noticing the small, luminous moments where art and life intersect. Noticing that validation, my mother's or anyone else's, was not a final destination, but one of many stops on a long road. I learned to measure success not only in plays and headlines, but in the number of people who found shelter in a chorus, in the way a lyric could become someone's private beacon. My mother and I became the kind of complicated friends that families sometimes become when they grow. We bickered about small things, celebrated big ones, and sometimes sat in silence and let songs do the talking. In the end, the revenge I had once imagined with such youthful certainty transformed into an act of witness. I bore witness to my own growth, to the woman who had once told me I'd never be famous, and to the ways we both had been shaped by fear and longing. My voice, recorded and streamed and played into 1,000 tiny speakers and headphones, had become a small kind of redemption, not because it humiliated her doubt, but because it invited her and me to see how far we had both come. The sentences that once felt like final judgments were retranslated into cries that announced not only pride but regret, and most importantly, love. I still remember the way her hands shook the first time she walked into a room where people were singing along to one of my songs. She gripped my elbow afterward and said, "I never imagined this." I squeezed back and replied, "And neither did I." There was a silence between us then that was full, not empty, like a room where a song has just ended and people are catching their breath. The sound of my voice on Spotify would continue to be a strange, looping testament, sometimes a cause for tears, sometimes for laughter, often a mirror. Revenge, in the end, had shown itself to be less about defeating and more about changing the terms of the game. Replacing harm with music, doubt with melody, hurt with something that deepens instead of destroys. If my mother's tears were at first a wound and later a benediction, that art, complicated, imperfect, mostly human, felt like the truest kind of triumph I could have written.